They called it a war against terror, but behind the curtains, it became a war for profit. In 2015, as Nigeria bled under the onslaught of Boko Haram, billions of dollars were disappearing, not into weapons, not into security, but into the pockets of the powerful. And at the center of this web of deceit stood one man, Sambo Dasuki, Nigeria's national security advisor. He was supposed to protect the nation. Instead, he allegedly masterminded one of the largest corruption schemes in Africa's modern history, a scandal that swallowed over $2.10 billion meant to defend soldiers on the front lines. This wasn't just theft, it was treason wrapped in bureaucracy, carried out in the shadows of government offices, with signatures instead of bullets. Tonight, we tell the story of how power turned to greed, how a network of politicians, businessmen, and generals transformed a national tragedy into a private fortune, and how their crimes still echo in the lives of ordinary Nigerians today. It began quietly. The country was desperate. By 2014, Boko Haram had taken control of towns in the northeast. Soldiers complained of fighting with outdated weapons, and families fled from burning villages. In Abuja, meetings were being held behind closed doors. The presidency needed answers. The people needed protection. And so, a massive fund was created, billions of dollars channeled through the Office of the National Security Advisor, led by Colonel Sambo Dasuki, a man once seen as disciplined, experienced, and loyal. But that loyalty, it turned out, wasn't to the people. What followed was not defense spending, it was a redistribution of wealth to the powerful. Money meant for arms was diverted to political campaigns, luxury homes, and phantom contracts. Companies with no record of defense expertise were paid millions. Invoices were forged, equipment was never delivered. And the soldiers, the very people whose lives depended on these funds, went to battle with nothing but courage and old rifles. When the scandal broke, it shocked even Nigeria's hardened public. But insiders whispered that the theft had been going on for years. Protected by a tight circle, a syndicate of ministers, business moguls, and military officers who used the guise of national security. To conceal one of Africa's most audacious heists, Dasuki himself was not alone. Investigators soon discovered a trail of payments, campaign donations masked as security contracts, millions funneled into election spending, and luxury acquisitions across Abuja, Dubai, and London. But what made the story truly tragic was its timing. Nigeria was bleeding. Families in Borno buried their sons. Troops retreated from towns they were supposed to defend. Every stolen dollar was a bullet that never reached the battlefield, a vehicle that never drove, a uniform that never arrived, a life that could have been saved. The first cracks appeared when whistleblowers within the central bank noticed irregular withdrawals. Massive transfers authorized under urgent national security expenditure. It didn't add up. The amounts were staggering. The beneficiaries suspicious. When Buhari's administration took power in 2015, a full audit was ordered. What it revealed was almost cinematic in scale. Billions in cash had been moved without proper records. Contracts were awarded to friends and allies. Funds had been laundered through shell companies and offshore accounts. In one instance, over 500 million was transferred to a political operative under the guise of prayer campaign services. Another 1.3 billion was allegedly sent to a private aviation company for aircraft that never existed. And in the middle of it all was the man whose office authorized every single payment, Sambo Dasuki, to the public. Dasuki became the face of corruption. To investigators, he was only the beginning, because once they pulled that first thread, the entire fabric of the Nigerian elite began to unravel. The story of Dasuki is not just about one man's greed. It's about how systems fail when accountability dies. He didn't steal the money alone. He operated within a culture, a machinery of impunity that rewarded loyalty more than integrity. In that system, contracts were currency, silence was power, and the people were expendable. Every transaction told a story. One businessman received millions to import military vehicles, yet records show not a single vehicle crossed the border. A former governor got hundreds of millions supposedly for a consultation. Another politician's campaign war chest grew mysteriously fat in the same month's arms deals were being signed. For years. It worked because everyone was feeding from the same trough, and as the money flowed, Nigeria's war against terror faltered. Villages were left unguarded. Ammunition ran low. Troops rioted over unpaid allowances. Mothers buried sons who died fighting with bare hands. When investigators finally moved in, the shockwaves were immense. The Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC, arrested dozens. Accounts were frozen. Mansions seized. And Sambo Dasuki himself, once untouchable, was taken into custody. Yet even then, many doubted justice would prevail. Because in Nigeria, scandals rarely end in convictions. They end in negotiations. Dasuki's arrest became a political theater, one that exposed not only his alleged crimes but the fragility of Nigeria's institutions. Some saw him as a scapegoat, a symbol of an era the new government wanted to erase. Others saw him as the mastermind of a betrayal that cost thousands of lives, but in truth, the $2.1 billion fraud was not the work of a single man. It was the product of decades of moral decay, built on the belief that national wealth is personal property. When investigators began to dig deeper, what they found was not a trail, it was a labyrinth. Layers of shell companies, forged receipts, ghost suppliers, and paper trails that looped back into the same inner circle. Every corridor led to another door, and behind each door stood someone powerful enough to make files. Disappeared. The Economic and Financial Crimes Commission called it the biggest diversion of public funds in Nigeria's democratic history. But even that description fell short. Because this wasn't only about numbers, it was about betrayal. In the months following Dasuki's arrest, prosecutors uncovered hundreds of transactions that painted a picture of systematic, deliberate looting. Banks cooperated. Auditors worked day and night. But many witnesses were scared. Some vanished. Others refused to testify. The case dragged through Nigeria's slow justice system, like a ghost moving through fog, visible for a moment, then gone again. Hearings were adjourned. Judges reassigned. Documents conveniently lost. For every revelation that reached the public, 10 more were buried in silence. Behind the scenes, political interests collided. Those who had benefited from Dasuki's generosity were now lawmakers, governors, and even cabinet members. The system he fed was the same system now pretending to investigate him. For the Nigerian people, it was déjà vu. They had seen this movie before, promises of justice fading into headlines. Confessions turned into negotiations, scandals recycled into campaigns. But something about this case refused to die. The $2.1 billion number burned into the national conscience like a scar. Families of fallen soldiers began to speak out. Widows went on television holding faded photographs of husbands who died in Sambisa Forest, saying he died because they stole the money meant to save him. Social media erupted. Youth movements demanded accountability. For the first time, corruption was not just a headline, it was personal. Nigerians could draw a direct line between political greed and the graves of their loved ones. As the trial unfolded, Dasuki maintained his innocence. In carefully crafted statements, he insisted he had merely followed orders, that every payment had been approved by the presidency. It was a defense as old as corruption itself. I was only obeying instructions. His allies echoed the same. They painted him as a loyal servant thrown under the bus for political theater. But the evidence told another story. Bank statements showed transfers to private accounts. Fake procurement letters carried his signature. Contracts awarded to companies owned by his associates. A paper empire built on the suffering of a nation. At one point, investigators traced $47 million in cash, withdrawn in a single day from the central bank, packed into metal boxes, and driven out under special security escort. No one could explain where that money went. The EFCC described it bluntly. Money meant for guns became money for elections. The 2015 general election had been one of the most expensive in Nigerian history, and suddenly, it made sense. Television ads, rallies, logistics, and vote-buying operations had been mysteriously well-funded. While soldiers begged for ammunition, the Dasuki Syndicate was not just stealing, it was manipulating democracy itself. In Abuja's courtrooms, the air grew heavy with tension. Each hearing drew journalists, diplomats, and citizens who wanted to believe that this time would be different, that the system would finally prove it could punish its own, but months turned into years. Motions delayed the process. Bail applications were filed and granted. Dasuki spent long stretches in detention, then was released, then rearrested. By 2019, he was finally granted freedom, still insisting on his innocence. Still unrepentant, the people watched, weary but not surprised. Justice in Nigeria had once again become a luxury, bought, delayed, or traded, yet the scandal left a permanent stain. It forced Nigerians to confront a painful truth: corruption isn't abstract crime. It is a living organism that feeds on hope, security, and trust. And the $2.1 billion scandal was its most grotesque feast. Years later, when investigative journalists revisited the case, they found the same familiar echoes. Many of the companies named in the probe had rebranded, still receiving government contracts. Some key suspects had switched political parties and found refuge in new alliances. The machinery of impunity had simply adapted. One reporter described it best: Nigeria doesn't bury scandals, it recycles them. But even as the dust settled, something had changed among the people. The young generation, disillusioned yet defiant, had begun connecting the dots between corruption and poverty, between political deceit and unemployment, between elite greed and insecurity. In universities, student journalists wrote exposes. Online, activists created threads explaining how the missing billions could have built schools, hospitals, and power stations. Ordinary citizens became auditors of their own government, and slowly, a cultural shift began, one that terrified the establishment. The ripple effects reached beyond Dasuki himself. His case exposed how the phrase "national security" had been weaponized to shield corruption. Budgets labeled as classified had become black holes where accountability went to die. As one civil society lawyer put it, security votes are the last refuge of thieves. The government responded with new committees, new reforms, and new rhetoric. But on the ground, little changed. Soldiers in the Northeast still struggled with inadequate pay and poor equipment. The same bureaucratic bottlenecks, the same shadow contracts, the same ghosts in the books. It was as if Nigeria's soul had been mortgaged, not for the people's safety, but for a few men's comfort, and that is the tragedy of the Dasuki affair. Its lesson was never fully learned, because corruption in Nigeria doesn't end with exposure. It ends with fatigue. The people grow tired, the media moves on, and the guilty find new masks. But stories like this have a way of resurfacing when least expected. In 2023, during another review of defense spending, auditors stumbled upon familiar names, old companies once linked to the Dasuki network, reappearing in new procurement lists. The pattern had returned. That discovery reignited public anger. Debates flooded radio shows, hashtags trended again. Nigeria's youth, now even more digitally empowered, demanded that this generation would not repeat the sins of the last, and while the old guard still held power, they could no longer ignore the noise. The internet had become the new courtroom. To understand the full weight of the Dasuki scandal, one must look beyond the bank statements and court files. One must look into the eyes of the victims, the soldiers who fought barefoot in Sambisa, the mothers who sold their jewelry to feed displaced families, the children who grew up never knowing peace. Those were the real casualties of corruption. Every dollar stolen was a child's future dimmed, a hospital that never opened, a soldier who never came home. When you add up those costs, the total is not $2.1 billion. It is something much greater. It is the moral debt of a nation to its own conscience. In the final scenes of this saga, there are no heroes, only lessons. The Dasuki case remains a mirror reflecting what Nigeria must confront if it hopes to move forward. For decades, Nigerians have been told that corruption is inevitable, that everyone steals, but this story proves otherwise. It proves that corruption is not a culture, It is a choice, repeated until it becomes tradition. And traditions can be broken. In recent years, small sparks of accountability have begun to appear. A new wave of journalists, prosecutors, and ordinary citizens are refusing to stay silent. Some whistleblowers, once exiled, have returned. Court cases are being revived. The road ahead is long, uncertain, and fraught with resistance. But the mere act of remembering, of telling these stories, is itself a form of justice. Imagine, for a moment, if those $2.1 billion had been used as intended. Nigeria's military could have been equipped with modern surveillance drones, armored vehicles, and proper logistics. Thousands of young men could have been saved from radicalization through education and jobs. The insurgency could have been weakened. The displacement crisis reduced, the economy strengthened. Instead, the money became mansions, SUVs, and secret accounts abroad. That contrast between what was stolen and what could have been built is the true heartbreak of Nigeria's corruption. In the quiet corners of Abuja, where the offices of power still hum with air-conditioned calm. Men like Dasuki are reminders of a time when greed wore a uniform and called itself patriotism. But outside those walls, a new generation is waking up. They are filmmakers, coders, writers, farmers, teachers united not by party or tribe, but by anger and hope. They are asking the questions their parents were too afraid to ask. They are demanding that the next Sambo Dasuki will not have a country left to rob. And in that awakening lies the real story, the slow, painful rebirth of accountability. One night, years after the scandal broke, a retired soldier was interviewed on a local radio program. His voice trembled as he recalled the battles fought with little ammunition and no backup. When asked what he felt knowing the money meant for them was stolen, he paused and said softly, "Maybe they forgot we were human too." That line lingers not just as sorrow, but as accusation against every leader who used the nation's suffering as an ATM, against every citizen who stayed silent when they should have spoken. So when history judges the $2.1 billion fraud, it should not be as just another corruption case, but as a turning point, a moral crossroad for Nigeria. Because if a nation can lose billions in the name of defense while its soldiers die defenseless, then it must decide what kind of future it truly wants. Either a future where truth is inconvenient and justice negotiable, or one where accountability becomes the new revolution. And perhaps that is where this story truly ends. Not in courtrooms, not in headlines, but in the hearts of Nigerians who finally say, enough. Because the most dangerous crime syndicate is not the one that steals money. It is the one that steals faith. And when faith dies, nations fall. But when faith returns, when citizens demand better, when leaders are forced to answer, when corruption becomes shameful again, nations rise, and maybe, just maybe, that is how Nigeria will one day reclaim what was lost. Not the billions, but its soul.